Hello, I'm Alina Polyakova, President and CEO of the Center for European Policy Analysis, and welcome to this really special fireside chat with Carl Gershman, now the former president of the National Endowment for Democracy. Carl, thank you so much for taking the time to join us for this conversation. I don't think Carl requires a lot of introduction, but for those of you who are just tuning in to this special edition of the CEPA Forum, Carl Gershman was the president of the National Endowment for Democracy, or the NED, for 37 years. Over his many decades of service, Carl became an iconic figure in Washington, D.C. for his engagement on democracy promotion, democratic values and principles, and really ushered NED through many years since its founding of difficulties in the global realm of democracy, including, of course, the end of the Cold War, the Tiananmen Square massacre, the Arab Spring, and many other developments across the world that challenged the very nature of democratic values and principles. But during Carl's time at the helm of the NED, the NED grew to become something quite unique. It was initially inspired, and I think we'll talk about that a little bit today, by some of the German political institutes, but the institution in the United States grew to be something much more than that. And it's for affiliated institutes that have political party affiliations, also grew to be something quite unique. And all of that was thanks to Carl's strategic leadership, his vision, and his undying commitment to democratic values and principles. And it strikes me that today we find ourselves in a very similar situation, perhaps, that we found ourselves when you first perhaps took over the National Endowment for Democracy in 1984, Carl, where the very principles of democratic governance are challenged on a daily basis, where we have rising models of authoritarianism emanating from China and, of course, Russia. And the NED, under your leadership, has been at the forefront of asking, how do we respond? How do we ensure that democracy remains a appealing and also dominant form of governance for the world? As perhaps frustrating as democracy can be, it is still an expression of governance that allows the ultimate freedom and liberties for the people to live in democratic institutions. So, Carl, thank you again for joining us. And I wanted to start us off by asking you to reflect on your almost 4 decades of service at the NED. You were at the helm since 1984. Can you take us back to that time? The world looked very different then, of course, than it does today, but there are some similarities I mentioned. So what prompted you to take on this mission of promoting democracy? It was a controversial move at the time. So can you take us back to that moment when you took over this fledgling initiative by President Reagan and invested and grew it to what it became today?
Thanks, Alina. It's great to be with you, and I'm just delighted at the relationship that the NED has had with CEPA. It was a very, very different period then than it is now. Actually, it was a much more optimistic period. Reagan went to Westminster and gave an address that a president couldn't give today. It just is unthinkable, the Westminster address. He talked about the democratic revolution that was starting in the world. Not everybody saw it, but later on, Sam Huntington called it the third wave of democratization, which was the greatest expansion of democracy in history. And the NED was created. It would be very, very difficult to imagine people coming together and creating something like the NED today. And it was really our rivals that were in deep crisis. And Reagan talked about it in the Westminster address. And also, I can remember a meeting that we had at NED. We had just gotten started. I think it was in 1986. And we brought together a lot of Soviet specialists. Zbig Brzezinski chaired the meeting. We had Leo Labitz there, Walter Laqueur, Maurice Friedberg, Dick Pipes was there to look at our programs in the Soviet Union. We wanted to, evaluate what we were doing. It was very early. And I remember that Zbig said at the meeting that the Soviet Union was no longer trying to penetrate and through its propaganda into the Western countries. They were being very, very defensive because they were afraid of Western ideas coming into the Soviet Union, which of course they were. And of course, the Soviet Union collapsed just 5 years later. So it was a very, very different period. And I got my start well before that as a political activist in a social democratic political movement that was strongly anti-communist and believed in carrying out the ideological struggle for democracy against communism. And when Daniel Patrick Moynihan was UN ambassador, U.S. ambassador to the UN, we connected with him. He wrote an article in the American Scholar which said that it was really the social democrats and the labor movement that knew best how to make the case for America, because they knew the alternative and they were also acculturated to the realm of ideology where that case had to be presented. So that was sort of the background, and we connected with people fighting for certainly dissidents, but also around the world to support them, people who were fighting for freedom and democracy. And it was a period when democracy was beginning to take off in the late 1970s. Huntington said the third wave began in 74 with the revolution in Portugal. And then finally, I went afterwards, right before Ned, I went to work for Jeane Kirkpatrick at the UN, and we just continued the struggle there. And I can remember giving my first speech to the third committee. Here, now we really had an audience. Before we were just talking to ourselves, but we really had an audience. And the issue was self-determination. And I talked about the Soviet Empire. You weren't supposed to do that at the end at the UN, and I got interrupted repeatedly by the ambassador from Bulgaria, from Belarus, and the Soviet Union. And I talked about the Soviet Empire, and they had to set aside a whole session of the third committee, 3 hours, for 19 rights of reply to my first speech. So that was what went before, but it really did, prepare me for what then became, NED. And so when I came to NED, I tried to continue that work.
So Carl, you've said before, just as a follow-up to this, that the NED wasn't supposed to be, it was important that it wasn't seen as anti-communist, but instead as pro-democratic.
Very good point,
and
very good point.
Can you talk about why that was such an important distinction,
Yes.
and why it was even controversial at the time?
I mean, the NED was not a Cold War institution. It was really an institution looking to the future, and it really was not what it's against; it's what it's for. And you have to say you're for democracy, and it also was a more consensual way of putting it. We were not to be an ideological organization in the sense that we were going to be fighting the kind of battle that I fought in the way I fought it when I was at the Social Democrats and at the U.S. mission to the UN. But by supporting Democrats around the world, we would be carrying forward those values, but in a consensual way, because we had to build a bipartisan consensus with liberals and conservatives.
Carl, just as a follow-up to what you just put out there, you said before as well that, and I think this is a really important point, that democracy is not inevitable, that it means it's tough. It takes the blood, sweat, and tears of people, of activists across the world, really fighting for those values. And of course, this is the community that NED has cultivated over its many years, the activists, the freedom fighters across the world. But of course, today, as you mentioned, it's a less optimistic time. And these individuals face great obstacles, great pressures in countries like Belarus and Hong Kong and elsewhere across the world. But the one thing I really want to get to, and I know you've spent a lot of time thinking about this, is even though we can't take democracy for granted, it does seem to me like some young people, and we've seen this in surveys, unfortunately, over and over again, do take it for granted. And they're much more open to ideas of military rule, for example. So what would you say to those young people living today who didn't experience the Cold War, who didn't live in authoritarian countries like I did, and like you were very familiar with what kinds of conditions people experience there? What would you say to those young people today who may take the openness and the freedoms and the liberties they have for granted?
I would say to them, you've got to look at the alternative. And it's not as if the alternative is something we can't see. I mean, what's just happened in Afghanistan? What are people running away from and running to? They're running to freedom. In the same way that the boat people in Vietnam were leaving, or from Cuba, were leaving a totalitarian situation and trying to run to freedom. And you just have to look at the world, the Chinese surveillance state, which is trying to capture images of people to control them, the genocide against the Uyghur people, Tibet, Hong Kong. You just have to look at what's going on in the world, and then try to make the connection with that and saying, okay, yes, we do have problems. And we had problems back, when I was an activist. When I started, Jim Crow still existed. That was legalized segregation in 7 states, that's what the civil rights movement was organized to defeat, to destroy, to have equal rights for everyone. And we do have a society that is capable of improvement. We do have problems. I find the polarization in the society to be very, very deeply troubling, because it makes it very, very difficult to understand that, the real problem is not the person you're against in your own society or the movement you're against in your own society, but the issue of freedom in the world. And we're fortunate to have freedom. I have said this before, but I think that this whole polarization between the so-called 1619 movement, which says that America was born in slavery, and that's what America is, and the 1776 is very unfortunate, because we did have slavery, and we still have to deal with the consequences of that, the legacy of that. But Martin Luther King, when he led the civil rights movement, he talked about the promissory note, the American creed. What was that? That was 1776. That was the fact that this is a country that can change, that can have freedom. And we have to find a way to come together around this. I've always thought that one thing that could be helpful would be to connect young Americans more with the kind of people that Ned supports, whether they're Afghans or Chinese activists or Uyghurs and so forth, or people from Ukraine and Russia. Because those are people who understand really the importance of democracy and freedom. Just Havel was always worried about the complacency of people who live in comfortable Western societies, that they would not appreciate the nature of totalitarianism and the danger that people in free societies face from these forces in the world. But those forces still exist. They're actually stronger now than when the NED was created, and our country is going to have to deal with this.
So when you said that the forces of authoritarianism, of autocracy, are stronger today than when NED was created in the early 80s and when you took over in 1984, I just want to follow up on that, because you've mentioned Sam Huntington earlier. You mentioned him in other interviews as well. And of course, he's famous for a lot of things. And one of the things he's most famous for is this idea of the waves of democratization, right? That you alluded to, the notion that throughout the arc of history, we've had moments when we've seen sort of explosions of a conversion and transformation to democracy. And the biggest one being the so-called third wave that you said started in the 70s. And of course, we have a huge explosion of democratic countries after the fall of the Soviet Union. But since then, there's been some research and thinkers who've suggested that we're actually in a counter wave now, that we're in a wave of autocratization. Where do you think where's the pendulum now?
Well, Sam did say that every wave was followed by a reverse wave. At least that's what the book is about.
Yes.
And although this has been an issue of contention among our little world, Larry Diamond referred to a democracy recession and refused to use the term reverse wave. But I think more recently he has used the term reverse wave. And I think it's fair to say that we are now in a reverse wave. And you just have to look at the Freedom House survey for 2020, which this was the 15th consecutive year of a decline in political and civil liberties in the world. And the number of countries where freedom and civil liberties declined was great. The number of countries exceeded the number of countries where it improved by a greater number than ever before. In other words, it's getting worse and getting worse more rapidly. And I regret to say that I think 2021 might see a continuation of that with some of the trends that are taking place in obviously Afghanistan and Tunisia and elsewhere. This is very, very worrisome. And it's obviously been made worse by COVID. The autocrats have used COVID to justify a further clampdown on freedoms, but also COVID has just destroyed the economies in certain countries. It's devastated Latin America. So you have backsliding in countries like Peru and others in Latin America because of the difficult economic circumstances. I had hoped, and I still hope, that that the United States can take advantage of the fact that we have far and away the best vaccines to help vaccinate the world and to make this something like the way we geared up for World War II, with billions and billions of vaccines. And if we could do that, because these vaccines are the Moderna and Pfizer vaccines, they're so vastly superior to the Chinese vaccines. I mean, Kim Jong-un just said North Korea will not take the Chinese vaccines because the American vaccines are effective. And if we could get those vaccines around to the world, I think it would just change the political dynamics. And also, look, this, I think it's the issue of the possible lab leak in Wuhan as the source of the pandemic is becoming now a much, much more prominent issue. I don't know that this will ever be proven, but certainly China's effort to cover that up, to prevent any discussion of that, and it's generally hostile behavior to the world and very aggressive behavior, is not helping its own narrative in the world. So there's a possibility for a change, but it's going to take real determined action and leadership by us, especially on the vaccine front, if this is going to happen.
So, Carl, to follow up on this notion of democratic reversal or recession, perhaps I still remain somewhat more optimistic, and I'm not ready to go to full reversal yet. But certainly we've seen democratic recession, backsliding, decay, whatever we want to call it, in countries where we were anticipating at the end of the Cold War to really be the lights of democratic transformation. Of course, these are the post-socialist states of Central Eastern Europe. But now we are seeing some really concerning trends on democracy in some of these countries. But I've heard you say before that even in those places, we need to examine the opportunities for taking the next steps. So what opportunities do you see in these countries that were once held up as the bastions of democratic transformation that are now seeing some quite worrisome reversal trends? Countries Central Eastern Europe and even Belarus, perhaps, which is going through a quite significant struggle for democratic freedom right now, which is looking less optimistic, unfortunately.
Well, I've always believed that you can take the next step. Sometimes people say, can you have democracy in this very difficult place? And I've said, well, it's a long, long struggle, but you can always take the next step. And in a way, when you think about it, that's what the NED has done, because what is a proposal which we would support with a grant is a next step. What would you do in this situation to try to improve the situation? And that's what we do. And I believe that that's possible everywhere. We've had a very vigorous program in North Korea. You can't find a more difficult place than that. But what we've done and in North Korea over more than 20 years has been extraordinary in opening North Korea up. And the progress that I think has been made is extraordinary, even though it's a very, very long-term process. So when you look at a country like Belarus, which is so difficult, I mean, you first have to recognize that there now is an international consensus on the illegitimacy of the Lukashenko regime. And that's very, very important. And you can use that and pressure that. Russia, which has its own troubles, won't be able to prop him up forever. There is talk about an election possibly taking place before the end of the year. If that's going to happen, you really want the Western countries to observe that election, to try to turn that kind of a thing into an opportunity. Belarus is a country with with what happened on August 9th, the election and then the uprising, the revolution. It's a nation reborn. There's a civic awakening in Belarus. I've seen some polls recently, very interesting, where 14% of the people have participated in the protests, and over 70% of the people are on social media to get their news, as opposed to the state media. So that's quite remarkable, and that shows that there's an awakening of the population, and you have real heroes who are in prison now. People like Yulia Slutskaya, the journalist, Andrei Alikovsky, and Alice Bialetsky, the human rights defender. These are heroes, and they are supported by the Belarusian people, and they should be supported, by people in the West. Belarus is a country that has awakened, and they continue to support the democracy movement. And you have people who are in prison, like Yulia Slutskaya, the journalist, and Andrei Alessandru. These are people who are heroes for freedom and democracy, and they're supported by the people in Belarus. And I think that the international community should be showing solidarity with these people. You go to a country like Ukraine. In Ukraine, it's an irreversible situation. Everything Putin has done is, really strengthened a sense of Ukrainian nationalism, and democracy continues in Ukraine. It's not going to reverse. You had a free and fair election, and in 2019, which was followed up by local and parliamentary elections. You have a process of decentralization, the establishment of anti-corruption institutions. Ukraine, too, is a country with a very active civic sector, and it's not going to change. And even in Poland and Hungary and the Czech Republic, polls show that young people overwhelmingly are not happy with the backsliding. In Slovakia, it's different, where Slovakia has had a better situation than in these other three countries in Central Europe. And you have young people, politicians who are, looking to raise money from individuals, not from oligarchs. They're on social media. Mm-hmm. This is a culture that's changed. By the way, this has happened globally. I mean, one reason you have this, the continuation of an uprising in a country like Burma, is that the young people in Burma have become much more modern. They're on social media. In Afghanistan, the enormous changes that have taken place. So Central Europe is not different. You have, political leaders there like Maya Sandu and Susanna Shaputova, who, represent a kind of political renewal in these countries. So even though it's a tough period, I don't believe that it's going to, there aren't opportunities, and that you can't get progress in the future.
What I think you're pointing to is that democratic transition or transformation, whether that's moving towards greater democracy, greater transparency, openness, freedom, etc., or if it's in the reversal phase, so to say, it's messy. There is no ideal type end state. And so I wonder, do you think this idea of consolidated democracies is still relevant? Is there really such a thing? Because even in Western democracies, we've seen some concerning trends, in so-called consolidated democracy. Is that really a useful idea anymore, given all of the trends that you've been describing?
Well, I've pointed out many times that the abolitionist Wendell Phillips said in 1858 that the price of liberty is eternal vigilance.
Yes.
You can never take it for granted. And I think what we've learned in our country in the past 5 years is that you can't take democracy for granted, even in the United States. And now our democracy is in great trouble with the very, very deep polarization that we have, and the inability to really find agreement on important policy changes, and the absence of a sense of national identity and purpose. No, democracy is very, very difficult. And if one of the things when I reflect, I didn't fully appreciate this at the beginning of NED about how difficult it was. And there was this idea of consolidation, and it's a very important, it makes it much more difficult to go backwards. But even then, we just know that these consolidations can become undone, and you can go backwards.
And of course, you mentioned the role of social media and how that has transformed democratic participation in so many different ways. Social media played a key role in the Maidan, the Revolution for Dignity in Ukraine in 2013, 2014, in the Arab Spring, of course, all over the world now. It's unimaginable to even think about perhaps a social movement without the role of some digital media being present. And of course, authoritarian countries like China and Russia see the kinds of threats that kind of participatory capability in the online space provides individuals. So you mentioned China already, and of course, China remains, I think, the greatest challenge when it comes to democratic values and principles, and the ability that the Beijing and the CCP have developed to really be able to repress and suppress people's ability to express themselves freely online. That the internet in China is very different than the internet we have in the United States and other Western societies. But I want to talk to you a little bit about Russia, which you've alluded to already. And I think one of the great unique features of the NED is its ability to have been a long-term committed partner for democracy promotion across the world. And of course, in the 1990s, after the fall of the Soviet Union, there was this moment of opening in Russia and other post-Soviet states. And of course, now with Mr. Putin being in power now for over 20 years in Russia, it doesn't look like democracy is coming back, perhaps. Authoritarian or autocratic consolidation seems to be there for the foreseeable future. And of course, the NED was de facto banned in Russia in 2015 and is no longer able to operate there officially. So I want you to talk a little bit about the challenge that Russia represents. I think it's quite common now to really think about China as the biggest problem. And I've heard you say before that yes, Russia's a problem, it's a declining power. But even so, it continues to wreak havoc across the world. Cyber attacks, ransomware attacks originating from Russia continue. Of course, Russia occupies Ukraine and Georgia, and we have the continuous frozen conflicts in other parts of the world like Moldova as well. How should policymakers try to balance the Russia-China challenge?
Well, it's very difficult. First, let me say that the NED was declared undesirable in 2015, and legal penalties were declared against anyone who would work with us. But frankly, our view was that if people want to work with us, we'll work with them. They're the ones who have to determine whether or not to take the risk. And our program has actually expanded. Our programs in Russia have actually expanded since 2015. We did not turn away. Some others did turn away, and they, those with offices were kicked out. But we don't have offices, so we couldn't be kicked out, and we continue to be very, very active there. I think that I think it's been very important that President Biden has said that he really wants to put new emphasis on the difference between authoritarianism and democracy, and to support democracy against authoritarianism, which is great. And he's also going to be convening a democracy summit. I regret that what has happened in Afghanistan is a grave setback to that policy. And I think the speech that he gave after the exit, where he talked about the focus just on national security interest, is going to have to be developed further so that we can put that into a larger context. What is the relationship between our security and freedom and democracy and the preservation of democratic global norms? That's very important. Regarding how the United States can deal with both of these countries simultaneously, there is a very lively, still, even though Putin has repressed this very badly, there is still an opposition there. I remain, in agreement with my friend Vladimir Kara-Murza that this opposition is not going away. It's deeply embedded in the young people in Russia. The economic situation is not very good. Putin is a nervous dictator. He's a nervous dictator. From a security standpoint, I agree with my friend Radek Sikorski, who wrote, recently in The Economist, that it's a good thing for Europe to try to develop a kind of strategic autonomy in defending itself against Russia, free the United States a little bit more to deal with China, which is the major threat to freedom in the world. But Russia is also a problem, and I think they work with each other. And I think what the democracies have to do is to work with each other as well, and to coordinate in this kind of a way. And I would hope that there can be greater cooperation between the transatlantic alliance and the Indo-Pacific alliance to bring Asia and and the transatlantic world closer together in support of democracy and also in the defense of Taiwan, which is now, after Afghanistan, in much greater jeopardy than before. And I think the United States is going to need our European allies in defending Taiwan and also working together with Taiwan, which is a vigorous democracy, in support of democracy elsewhere in Asia.
So let's dig in a little bit more on China then. You are one of the select few who've been sanctioned by the Chinese government, and you've clearly been at the forefront of Beijing's disdain for Western democracy and the kind of promotion efforts that the West is engaged in. The PRC's justification for your designation was over the NED's operations in Hong Kong, which was seen as a significant democratic erosion, which has seen significant democratic erosion in the last few years since Beijing's takeover. In what ways do you think the situation in Hong Kong is emblematic of a broader struggle in supporting democracy movements in a surveillance state like China?
Well, certainly Xi Jinping thought it was. I mean, they saw Hong Kong as a potential Trojan horse bringing these values in an organized way into China, and they have tried to suppress that. And so far, they've been successful. We'll see what will happen. Xi Jinping and the regime is actually fearful of democratic values. I mean, the first thing that he did when he became the president of China was to issue document number 9, which called for an intensification of the struggle against liberal values, civil society, independent media, constitutional government. They saw that as the great threat to this regime, and they're very, very fearful about it. And that's why they have such very tight repression. The question is, can they succeed? And you just had the 100th anniversary of the Chinese Communist Party on July 1st, and we organized a big event on that occasion. And all of the specialists we brought together, Elizabeth Economy, Andy Nathan, Min Jin Pei, Perry Link, all of them agreed that this was a system that was in crisis, and that while totalitarianism can delay the process of opening by building up a middle class through the economic development that would demand greater freedom, while it can delay that, ultimately it can't prevent it. And as China becomes more isolated, as the security situation worsens, it's going to be in a position where it's going to have to devote more resources to its security, to its military. And Min Jin Pei, for one, is somebody who talked about a potential collapse in China. So the regime is not secure. Perry Link, in fact, in the discussion that we had on the 100th anniversary of the Chinese Communist Party, compared the Xi regime with its very centralized structure, with its very repressive and aggressive posture, with 2 Chinese dynasties, one in the 3rd century before the Common Era, and the other in the 7th century in the Common Era. 2 dynasties that were short-lived. One lasted 18 years, the other 37 years, but they were short because they were just too autocratic, too centralized. And you just even had a statement by George Soros. I saw it only yesterday, a statement saying that Xi Jinping has lost touch with economic reality. The crackdown on the private businesses is going to lead, in his view, to a crash. So we don't know what's going to happen in China, and we shouldn't assume that just because Xi Jinping is flexing his muscles and introducing the surveillance state and the social credit system, which tries to reward and punish people according to their obedience, that this is going to work, and that the Xi regime is here to stay.
Yeah, authoritarian states are stable until they're not.
And that could happen the problem is it could happen very, very quickly. And it could be very destabilizing and dangerous for the world, but we should not assume that the Xi Jinping regime is here forever.
Well, I think that is a good point of optimism in some ways,
Yes.
actually, Carl. So thank you. I now want to turn to some of our fellows, former fellows, alumni from CEPA, as well as a former NED fellow. So I now want to go to a question from a CEPA fellow, a former Reagan-Fassel fellow of the NED, and a good friend and colleague of mine and yours as well, Carl, Peter Krako.
Hi, Carl, and thank you for all the work you have done in the last decades. And I would have only a simple question to you. who were the most inspiring politicians, activists, intellectuals, public intellectuals you have met while you were leading NED? And please name 3 of them. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Peter. It's great to see you, and it was wonderful having you at NED, even virtually, as a Reagan Fellow. It's very hard. You limit me to 3 people, and I think I know who those 3 people are, but there are many others that I just want to mention. The Dalit activist in Nepal, Subhash Darnal, who I've written about him and was just an extraordinary activist. I compared him to my mentor, Bayard Rustin, the civil rights leader, who is another person that I would think about, and the Polish philosopher Leszek Kolakowski, and so many others. The Cuban, I never met Osvaldo Paya, but he is somebody also who is in that rare category, the Cuban leader. But if I had to mention 3, one would be the Dalai Lama, who I think has been able, in the most remarkable way, to transform his exile into a gift for humanity. He said he's the unluckiest Dalai Lama because he's lived his life mostly in exile, but here he's given so much to the world. And the second was his very, very good friend, and just an extraordinary leader, Václav Havel, who I did get to know, and then work very, very closely with his people. And the Forum 2000 continues to be a force for international democracy today. Havel created it with Elie Wiesel back in 1996, but it was Havel that nominated Liu Xiaobo for the Nobel Peace Prize. And even though I didn't meet Liu Xiaobo, I want to name him as the third because, again, I've indirectly known him. I've met his widow, Liu Xia, and Liu Xiaobo was an incredible voice for democracy. He was the most important voice for democracy in the world, in my view, since the beginning of the 21st century. And it's very important to underline the fact, especially in light of what some people have said about Asian values, that he is Asian. Comes from a Confucius society, but yet he was the most eloquent and important voice for freedom and democracy, I think, in the world. And of course, the Chinese regime arrested him, prevented him from going to receive the Nobel Peace Prize in 2010, kept him in prison, and in effect, really murdered him.
I now want to go to a question from CEPA Senior Fellow, the founder of the European Academy of Diplomacy and the co-founder of the Warsaw Security Forum, coming to us from Poland, Katarzyna Pisarska.
Dear Carl, you have dedicated a lifetime of service to defending democracy. And there were some amazing moments like 1989 in my region, Central Europe, when democracy flourished and grew. But what we have been seeing over the last few years is a democratic recession throughout the spectrum. When you look back in the last 3 decades of your service, and if there's one thing that you would wish you have done differently, what would that be?
Well, I've talked about it a little already. Thank you very much, Katarzyna. I've talked about it a little bit already, and that's China. I feel that I did not appreciate early enough where China was headed. I mean, there was this naive hope based upon what you might call the East Asian model of democratic development, that economic growth and modernization would lead to democracy. And it was Liu Xiaobo, who I've just talked about, who warned in an essay in 2006 that if China grew as a dictatorship, it would represent a threat to democracy and liberal values all over the world. I didn't quite see it. It also had a devastating effect, the way we, in a sense, exported so many millions of jobs to China. It had a devastating effect on our own democracy. Some of my trade union friends talked about that in the 90s, and I was not 100% in agreement with them, even though I saw what was happening, because I thought that this was inevitable and would ultimately liberalize China. I think it will, perhaps, in the long run, and that is my great hope. But for the time being, the effect of China's rise, China's growth, has been to provide more resources for China, and to strengthen its military and its economy, and to make it a much more dangerous country for the world. And I feel I don't think we would have done, Ned would have done anything differently, because Ned was always supporting Liu Xiaobo and all the writers and activists and people trying to use whatever spaces existed in China to expand those spaces. So I don't think it would have changed anything we did, but I feel somehow that I should have had a better early appreciation of that than I did.
Hello, my name is Olga Zykova. I'm from Kiev, Ukraine, working in the Ministry of Finance as the head of Department on Foreign Affairs and Analytics, and I'm James Denton Transatlantic Fellow of 2019. It is a great pleasure for me to participate at the current CEPA forum and to have opportunity to deliver a question to Mr. Carl Gershman. Honorable Mr. Gershman, you've already written so many outstanding pages of your life, the whole history, especially in your capacity as the president of the National Endowment for Democracy. So therefore, let me ask you, during your lifetime and your service, did you manage to come to the conclusion what democracy is?
Thank you, Olga. That's a great question. I don't think it's very hard to understand what democracy is. Democracy is the only system that really allows for the flourishing of human dignity, human individuality, human freedom. It doesn't work in any other system. It's very complex. It's very difficult to make it work, but it's the only system that allows people to have dignity and to determine their own destiny within, obviously within a framework of rules that respects the dignity of others. And I think it's because people want freedom, people want to have their dignity respected, that democracy is continuing to progress. And as Tocqueville saw when he wrote a long time ago, that this is almost a providential force in the world that's going to continue to progress. And the great question that faces all of us is, as equality progresses, how do we preserve liberty? That's the great challenge that we all face. And my dear friend Leszek Kolakowski wrote brilliantly about that. And I think that the balancing these goods of equality and liberty is the great challenge that we all face.
Well, Carl, thank you. That was a true tour de force.
Oh, well.
Sobering analysis in some points, but I also think there are moments of optimism in our conversation as well. And given the many years that you've committed of your life and for your many years of service in the interest of democracy and values and principles, and at the end, the greater human liberty and greater human freedom. I mean, that is what democracy is truly about, as you said. It's about the greater equality, greater openness, greater ability for us to be able to freely express ourselves as individuals in the full meaning of that term. I know that the NED will continue on with the incredibly powerful, impactful foundation that you and everyone else, I know institutions don't get built by just one person. I know it takes many hands. And I know you have an incredible group of people at the NED that will continue to be the torchbearers for the next generation. And I certainly hope that we return to optimism in the years ahead. And in even the hardest and darkest moments, that we retain the inspiration that I think you have laid the foundation for, and others have laid the foundation for. And I just want to thank you for sharing your reflections with us, sharing your ideas. I know you'll continue to share your ideas in the years ahead. I look forward to reading more from you as you take up more writing and more intellectual thinking. And thank you for being such a light here in Washington, but really across the world, and for continuing the fight for freedom. It never ends, does it?
No.
And thank you for your time.
Thank you. It's been a great pleasure to be with you, Alina. Great pleasure.
Thank you, Carl.
Good luck.